August 2nd, 1876, Wild Bill Hickok was shot dead in a poker game in Deadwood, South Dakota, a town that had pulled $1 million in gold from the ground but had no sheriff, no government, and no legal right to exist. Deadwood sat on Lakota Sioux land, guaranteed by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, crammed into a narrow gulch where somewhere between 5,000 and 25,000 people were building a city as fast as pine boards could be nailed together. And they had 173 businesses running before the year was out, while the nearest railroad was over 200 miles away in Sidney, Nebraska. The place had 3 sawmills before it had a single lawman, and the name came from dead timber standing gray and barkless on hillsides above Whitewood and Deadwood creeks that met at the canyon floor where gold had been discovered in the fall of 1875. And by the following spring, 7 mining camps merged into a single, sprawling settlement hemmed in by steep forested hillsides that created one of the most extraordinary and lawless communities in American history. By July 1876, miners had pulled $4 million worth of gold from the gulch, attracting merchants, lawyers, teamsters, prostitutes, and at least one printer named A.W. Merrick, who published the first issue of the Black Hills Pioneer on June 8, 1876, giving Deadwood a newspaper before it had a jail. That same summer, Jack Langrish arrived with his acting company and opened Deadwood's first theater in July, performing the latest Broadway hits to audiences who paid in gold dust. And within a week of the theater's opening, Wild Bill Hickok was murdered next door, and the theater was immediately requisitioned for the murder trial. James Butler Hickok was already a national celebrity when he sat playing poker at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon number 10, and he usually sat with his back to the wall. But on this afternoon, the only open chair faced away from the door, and another player refused to switch seats. A drifter named Jack McCall, who had lost to Hickok the night before and been offered money for breakfast in what he took as an insult, walked up behind him, put a .45 caliber revolver to his head, and fired, killing Hickok instantly while he held 2 pair, aces, and eights, a hand poker players still call the dead man's hand. The next day, the camp assembled a miners' court, appointed a judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, and jury. And after a 2-hour trial, McCall was acquitted and told to leave town. But there was no legal basis for any of it, because there was no incorporated town, no territorial authority, and no recognized jurisdiction. McCall fled to Wyoming, where he bragged about the killing, and federal authorities declared the Deadwood trial illegitimate, rearrested him, tried him in Yankton, and hanged him on March 1st, 1877. Seth Bullock had arrived the day before Hickok was killed, though they never met, a Canadian-born former sheriff who came to sell hardware with his partner, Sol Starr, a Bavarian-born Jewish immigrant, and they rolled in with an ox-drawn wagon full of mining equipment. Within a year, they had built a store at the corner of Main and Wall Streets, an address that would prove consequential, and after the Hickok murder, the camp appointed Bullock as sheriff. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that could stare down a cobra, and he tamed the wildest town in the West, reportedly without killing anyone. By 1877, George Hearst arrived, a Missouri mining magnate who had made fortunes at the Comstock Lode in Nevada. When brothers Fred and Moses Manuel struck gold near Lead in April 1876, Hearst bought their claim for $70,000 and then started buying everything around it, assembling 30 acres of ore-bearing land and building an 80-stamp mill that began crushing ore in July 1878. In 1879, he listed Homestake Mining Company on the New York Stock Exchange, reportedly the first publicly traded mining stock in America, then moved on to Montana Copper. leaving behind a mine that would operate for 126 years and produce over 40 million troy ounces of gold worth over $70 billion at today's prices. The homestake transformed the Black Hills economy from placer mining to industrial extraction, and by the mid-1880s, it employed over 2,000 men, while the company town of Lead surpassed Deadwood's population by 1885, though Deadwood remained the commercial capital where miners spent their pay. On September 26, 1879, at 2:30 in the morning, a baker knocked over a coal oil lamp, and fire raced through Deadwood's pine buildings, when flames reached Jensen and Bliss Hardware and found 8 kegs of black gunpowder. The explosion sent burning planks across the gulch, igniting rooftops on the far side. Deadwood had a volunteer fire company, but no water system beyond the creek, and over 300 buildings burned while 2,000 people were left homeless. The damage ran to $1.6 million, and many people left forever, but the people who stayed rebuilt in brick and stone with an image of permanence. Within 6 months, a new Deadwood had risen with Victorian commercial buildings, featuring Italianate facades, sandstone foundations, and decorative cornices, and the architecture visible on Main Street today is essentially the architecture of 1880, which means the fire that nearly killed the town created the town that would endure. Al Swearingen rebuilt too, having opened his Gem Variety Theatre in April 1877 as the most profitable and notorious establishment in the Gulch. While Langrish offered Shakespeare, Swearingen offered prize fights, singers, and primarily prostitutes, taking in an estimated $5,000 on an average night through what was technically a saloon, but in practice a brutal brothel, where he recruited women from the East through false job advertisements and forced them into prostitution through threats and beatings. The 1879 fire destroyed it, and he rebuilt it bigger. The 1894 fire destroyed it again, and he rebuilt again. But when it burned a third time, in 1899, he was done, leaving town and eventually dying in 1904 after being found beaten in a Denver rail yard. As the Gem held court at one end of Main Street in the 1880s, the other end was transforming as Deadwood became civilized. Electric lights flickered on in December 1883. Less than 4 years after Edison demonstrated the bulb, telephone lines went up in 1878, and telegraph service connected Deadwood to Cheyenne by December 1876, making this a town racing to join the modern world. The Chinatown that developed on Lower Main Street was the largest Chinese community east of San Francisco, with 221 Chinese residents by 1880 running laundries, restaurants, and groceries. Phi Li Wong, who went by Wing Tzu, sold 2 gold claims for $75,000 and opened the Wing Tzu Emporium at 566 Main Street, importing silk and tea, building brick buildings in 1885 and 1896, and inviting neighbors to celebrate Chinese New Year. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 strangled the community until by 1931, the last resident left and Chinatown existed only in memory. Before the railroad, everything traveled by stagecoach or ox-drawn wagon over roughly 300 miles from Cheyenne through dangerous country, with shotgun messengers riding alongside treasure coaches carrying gold. When the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad finally arrived on December 28, 1890, it ended 14 years of cultural isolation, allowing new goods and acting companies to reach town and bringing immigrants from across Europe and Asia to a community that already included Germans, Irish, Norwegians, English, Chinese, African Americans, and Jewish merchants from Prussia and Bavaria. After the 1894 fire, destroyed Bullock & Starr's hardware store, Bullock made his most consequential business decision by building a hotel instead. They spent $40,000 constructing a 3-story, 63-room Italianate hotel with red velvet carpeting, brass chandeliers, oak trim, a Steinway grand piano, and steam heat throughout, the finest accommodation between Minneapolis and the Pacific. Bullock had befriended Theodore Roosevelt in August 1892, a friendship that lasted until Roosevelt's death in 1919, when Bullock helped erect the first monument to the late president, Friendship Tower on Mount Roosevelt. And Bullock died of cancer months later in September 1919, at 70 years old, while Sol Starr, who had served as mayor for 14 years across 10 terms, had died 2 years earlier. The early 1900s were in many ways Deadwood's finest hour, because in 1903, the Franklin Hotel opened on Upper Main Street and made the Bullock look modest, as Harris Franklin, born Harris Finkelstein, a Prussian Jewish immigrant who had arrived in Deadwood with almost nothing and built a fortune through mining, liquor sales, and banking, had offered to match every dollar invested in the project, and the final cost was $100,000, more than $3.5 million in today's money, for 80 rooms with Greek Revival columns, a lobby fountain, a cigar store, a newsstand, a barbershop, 2 private parlors for ladies, a masseuse, steam heat, an elevator, electric lights, and telephone service in every room. The grand opening on June 4th, 1903, drew 250 guests to a banquet, and Theodore Roosevelt stayed there, as did William Howard Taft, who dined at the Franklin in October 1911, and Babe Ruth, who played a barnstorming baseball game at the Deadwood Amusement Park in October 1922. And the Franklin was the kind of hotel that made a town feel like a city, and a Carnegie Free Library opened in 1904, while the Lawrence County Courthouse was completed in 1907, and a new federal courthouse and post office opened in 1908. But Deadwood's fundamental problem was always geography and economics, because the town sat in a gulch and could not sprawl, and its economy depended on a single industry, gold mining, which increasingly meant a single operation, the homestake, which was located not in Deadwood, but in Lead. So Deadwood was the supply town, the entertainment town, the county seat, but it did not own the mine, and the economic engine was always just down the road, close enough to sustain Deadwood, but never truly Deadwood's own. There was a strange grace period during the Depression when, while the rest of the country suffered, gold mining actually became more attractive because the price of gold was fixed, labor was cheap, and the government had an interest in domestic production, and the homestake management shortened the work week but raised wages and provided year-end bonuses. So Lead and Deadwood weathered the 1930s better than most American communities. But the 20th century brought waves that Deadwood rode with diminishing success. Prohibition arrived in 1919, and although South Dakota had already passed its own prohibition law back in 1889, enforcement was sporadic at best, and when the federal ban took effect, Deadwood saloons and gambling halls simply moved behind closed doors, and through the 1920s, drinking, gambling, and prostitution continued to operate with varying degrees of discretion. The federal repeal in 1933 brought gambling back into the open, and it flourished until 1957, when it was officially shut down again, though the backroom games continued and the brothels persisted too, running more or less openly in the Badlands district well into the 20th century, until the last 4 did not close until May 1980, when federal and state authorities conducted a final raid. The Great Depression hit, and the Franklin Hotel converted to apartments, while Mount Rushmore, carved between 1927 and 1941, just 60 miles to the south, brought tourists through the Black Hills, and some of them found their way to Deadwood, and the town's population reached its 20th century peak around 1940, with just over 4,000 residents. But the war years drained it, as gold mining was suspended by federal order because the War Production Board needed the men and machinery elsewhere. After the war, the slow arithmetic of decline set in, as the homestake modernized and kept producing. But employment fell, as machines replaced men, and tourism carried the summer months, but the winters were long and quiet. The 1959 wildfire burned over 4,000 acres and consumed 60 structures, including homes and lumber plants, while an evacuation order was issued, and the property losses deepened a regional economic downturn that had already been building. And in 1961, the Department of the Interior designated the entire town a National Historic Landmark, recognizing what everyone in Deadwood already sensed, that the town's greatest asset was no longer its gold, but its past. The population kept slipping until by 1980 it was 2,035, and by 1990 it was 1,830, and buildings on Main Street stood empty or deteriorated, while the Bullock Hotel, that $40,000 showpiece with the Steinway and the lobster dinners, had been sold to a family who converted it into a hardware store in 1976 and auctioned off all the original furnishings, including the brass beds, the oak dressers, and the chandeliers, scattering them to whoever bid highest. Then, on December 15th, 1987, fire struck again when the Syndicate block on Lee Street, 3 historic buildings, burned to the ground. And this time the destruction catalyzed something unexpected, because a group of local visionaries who called themselves the Deadwood You Bet Committee had been working for years on an audacious plan to legalize gambling in Deadwood and use the tax revenue to fund historic preservation. And the footage of the Syndicate fire became their most powerful argument. They spent 5 years gathering signatures and support, contributing 20,000 volunteer hours, and in November 1988, South Dakota voters approved a constitutional amendment allowing limited stakes gaming in Deadwood with 65% of the vote. And on November 1st, 1989, an actor dressed as Wild Bill Hickok, accompanied by a woman playing Calamity Jane, fired a revolver into the air and the casinos opened, making Deadwood the 3rd legal gambling destination in the United States after Nevada and Atlantic City. The initial bet limit was $5 and was raised to $100 in 2000, then to $1,000 in 2012, while roulette, craps, and keno were added in 2015. And through the first 20 years, gamblers wagered over $12.7 billion in Deadwood's casinos, while the casinos paid more than $208 million in taxes and fees, and the city received over $123 million for local improvements. Real estate prices surged. Kevin Costner bought a casino in the restored Phoenix Block building. HBO launched the critically acclaimed series Deadwood in 2004, which ran 3 seasons and a movie, and embedded the town's legends into the national imagination once more. And the Bullock Hotel was rescued as new owners purchased the building in the early 1990s and spent years restoring it, stripping paint, restaining woodwork, repapering ceilings in Victorian patterns, and hanging brass chandeliers chosen from period replicas, consolidating the original 63 rooms into 28 larger ones while adding a casino floor in the lobby. What gambling saved was the architecture, but what it changed was the character, because today, if you walk down Main Street, the brick facades are immaculate and the Victorian details are preserved with the kind of care that only dedicated tax revenue can buy. But behind most of those facades on the ground floors are slot machines, and the sound of Deadwood in the 21st century is not the clang of stamp mills or the shouts of miners or the strains of a Langrisher Company performance, but the electronic chirp of video poker. The Homestake Mine, the engine that built the whole region, ceased production at the end of 2001 after low gold prices, poor ore quality, and high costs made it unviable. And after 126 years of continuous operation, the longest-running mine in American history went quiet. Though in 2007, the National Science Foundation selected the old mine as the site for the deep underground science and engineering laboratory where physicists now search for dark matter and study neutrinos nearly a mile below the surface. So the mine that George Hearst bought for $70,000 and that produced 40 million ounces of gold now hunts for the origins of the universe. The 2020 census counted 1,156 people in Deadwood with a median age of 56, and nearly a third of residents were 65 or older, while the most common employment sectors were arts and entertainment, accommodation and food services, and retail, which is the infrastructure of a tourist economy, and the town draws around 2 million visitors a year who come for the casinos, for the reenactments of the Hickok shooting that have been performed every summer since 1924, for Mount Moriah Cemetery, where Hickok and Calamity Jane are buried side by side, for the Adams Museum, for the days of 76 Rodeo, and they walk down Main Street past the Bullock and the Franklin and the spot where the Gem used to stand and the 600 feet of pavement that was once the largest Chinatown east of San Francisco, and they take photographs of a town that looks in its bones almost exactly like it did in 1880, when the people who refused to leave after the Great Fire rebuilt it in brick and stone, determined to make something permanent out of a place that had every reason to disappear. And Deadwood is still there. The creek still runs beneath the street, and the town that began as America's most lawless city survives today as a monument to its own wild past. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.